Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly webinar. Today's topic is scaling with Confluence and Jira. And we have two special guests, two great presenters that I'll introduce in just a moment. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm doing the introduction. Then we'll go through a presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So a couple things about housekeeping in general and the Q&A specifically. First, everyone's microphone is muted today. We'd love to do an interactive webinar, but in this particular situation, we have a fair number of attendees. In fact, we have a very good number of attendees. Normally, we get about a 50% attendance rate based on registrations. We're looking more like 70 or 80% today, so that's awesome. Thank you, everyone. But we keep the microphones muted to avoid the barking dogs and passing ambulances and so on. Just the presenters' microphones will be opened. And therefore, what we'd like you to do is use the Q&A feature built into the webinar platform that we use. So at the bottom of your screen, it goes away when you're not moving your mouse, but if you move your mouse, you'll see a little Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that icon, you can pose your questions, any questions you may have there in that Q&A dialog box. I will read those questions to our presenters at the end of the webinar. And I suggest you go ahead and type out your questions as they come to mind. You might forget them, or you might have to leave early. And if you pose a question that we don't answer live because we have too many, that's happened in the past, don't worry, we'll follow up with you by email. Finally, I just want to let you know the webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to come back to it later to review some of the topics that were discussed today if you'd like. You can share it with colleagues, etc. So you'll find details about that at the end of the presentation. So let me introduce our two presenters today and myself. By the way, I'm Dave Rosenlund from ALM Works. I'm going to be the host today. But joining me are the people who really know what they're talking about. Matt Reiner from K15 and Phil Heijkoop from ALM Works. Matt is an experienced Confluence administrator and advocate. Before joining K15T, he worked in industry like all of you and was a Confluence administrator on the customer side of the equation. Today he works for K15 where he's an advocate for Confluence and a promoter of Confluence. He's introduced many teams to new ways of collaborating using Confluence, both for the production of documentation, marketing content, and knowledge bases. And he's prepared to share the knowledge that he has both on the customer side and the consulting side with us today. After Matt presents, Phil Heijkoop from ALM Works is going to present. Phil is our senior lead solutions engineer here at ALM Works. He and his team are responsible for ensuring customer success with ALM Works products, among other things. Phil has an interesting background too. He's a former software developer, so not only, and a software project leader, so not only can he talk about the products in the Atlassian stack and the products we'll discuss today, he can talk about it from the perspective of a user. He also has a passion for teaching others. Phil's really good at teaching others, and all of the classes he conducts for our customers, we always get kudos back from the reviews. So he's good at what he does. And speaking for myself at least, I know I always feel smarter after talking with Phil. He's one of those folks that knows a lot about a lot of different topics. So he'll share some of what he knows today with all of you. So those are our two presenters for today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. I'll come back at the end of the presentation again to host the Q&A sessions. I'll read your questions to our presenters. Over to you, Matt. Matt, be sure to unmute your microphone.
There we are. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt with K15T. If you've never heard of us, we make a bunch of apps for Confluence. We have a lot of experience with Confluence. As Dave mentioned, I have a background with Confluence. And today I wanted to share some of the things we've experienced as we've scaled with Confluence and as we've helped other organizations scale with Confluence. Now, you may have experienced this when the company is new and your organization is new, you just have a few people, right? And you might not need to have stand-up meetings so you can collaborate on content or on other efforts, because you might be literally standing next to each other. And you might not need to write blog posts to update people on things, because you might just be able to shout across the room and all 5 people hear your update. Things tend to move very organically, very naturally. And one person might own what could be 2 or 3 departments of a larger company. And that's great and exciting. But then as you grow, right, all the same things need to happen. People still need to work together. Information still needs to be shared. But now, rather than there being individuals, there's multiple teams and multiple departments doing the same work, but the need is still there. How do we share content and collaborate between these different groups? And that's really the sweet spot for K15T. We're really passionate about not just enabling teams to work together within that team, but across the organization for individuals to be able to work with each other, no matter what team and department they're in. And so, let's start by looking at, how do people collaborate? What's a really good tool for collaborating on content? And I'm sure you're probably thinking it. I know I am. It's email, right? Email is an incredible tool, right? Throw your content in there, add 40 people, and start sending emails back and forth to build that content. Now, of course, I'm joking. This can get really messy really quickly. And if you're like me, you might be trying to escape something like this. And we are not alone. There's a lot of people who really cannot stand being stuck in an email thread. And that's just because email is just not a great tool for working together on things, and certainly not for formatting and versioning content. So what is the tool for that? Well, it's coming to mind now, right? Word. It's perfect, right? It's one column of white that I can put all my content on. I throw it in an email and start emailing it back and forth. And we can create, we can iterate on the content and create some new versions, right? So I got my Word file here. I throw it in my email and email it out, and we update it, right? We got a version 2, which is great. But then I'm at my desk and I realize, oh, shoot, we need to change some things, but I got to meet with the team. Oh, but then the team met without me and they made a new version. So I have to merge my changes in with theirs. But it's cool. We have another meeting. And so we've got it all together now in a final version. But then another team adds some critiques. And so we have another final version. And then the design team adds some imagery, and so on and so forth. This could go on forever. You've probably experienced this, and this tends to feel like you're working in 1999. That's because, this was really like cutting edge stuff then. But we're in 2020. There's got to be a better way for teams to collaborate on content, like at the same time, right? Using the internet. Well, of course, there's a solution for that. Thank goodness, right? We've got Google Drive. We've got G Suite and Office 365, which is enabling teams to get into a doc and write content together live. It's really amazing. Except there's kind of a major downside, and that is these tools tend to create silos. Because when you set up Office 365 or G Suite, you create team folders. And so, yes, a team can work together on content, but that content is separated from other teams using these folders. So it's still not accessible to the entire organization. And tools like these really tend to create a lot of issues for users. Like the average person gets 121 emails a day. 49% of people have trouble finding information, and they spend 2.5 hours a day searching. 33% of people are struggling with versioning, right? Well, how do I do it? I just change the name of the file and email it to people? It's hard. And that's because these tools are built for a closed way of working, either for an individual or a team to create content, rather than Confluence, which we believe is an open tool, which is built for not only creating content within a team, but sharing that content and collaborating on that content across an entire organization. And you might be like me. You might be on this webinar thinking, yeah, Confluence, it's great. I love it. I believe in it. This would change my organization. But I just got another email with a Word file in it. Like, why are people not using Confluence? We have it out there. It's great. Why aren't they using it? So what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the things we found are very successful when it comes to driving that Confluence adoption and scaling Confluence across your entire organization. So the first thing we found is content matters a lot. Nobody wants to come to an empty space. They hear about this new tool and they get there and they're like, hey, where are the requirements documents? Or how do I share an idea with my team? Where's our travel policy, our corporate design guidelines? What about that diagram I'm looking for? Or how do I just ask a question? If people are going in there looking for stuff that they can't find, they're probably not going to come back, right? They've been burned by tools before. But if you work at a company like K15T or Atlassian, the answer is there's a page for it, right? If you are looking for something, if you have a question, there's a page that answers that question, right? We have pages that help you figure out where we have lunch each day, or what do I do when my kid gets sick, or how do I share my blog idea with the marketing team so we can do a public blog. We have pages for all of those things, and we're not alone, right? Atlassian, for example, has a page for people that work at the San Francisco office, so you can learn how do I bring my pet to work, or how do I get a new badge for the door. These sorts of questions could take up hours of company time over the long term if people have to track down people and ask them. And that's really important when you're thinking about the value of Confluence and how it helps your organization scale. Think about how much time you spend in short meetings. I'm talking like, oh, hey, just 4 people, we're just going to take 15 minutes and sync up on a topic, right? Just 15 minutes. First of all, that is really an hour because it's 15 minutes times 4 people. That's kind of a lot. But you all get together and you get on the same page, right? And then everybody's updated and you get back to your desk and someone's like, hey, what's the update on this, right? And you have to spend more time iterating that. And that's because maybe the 4 of you are on the same figurative page, but we recommend replace these meetings with an actual page in Confluence. Spend some time, add your updates, communicate the information that needs to be communicated, but then it's valuable for everyone in the organization. No need to reiterate. So look at your calendar and figure out what meetings am I part of that we could replace with a meeting today. That's a really great way to see instant value with Confluence in your organization. Another thing that's really important is help users understand what content to start creating in Confluence. Don't tell them to put everything in there at once. They won't trust it. Instead, start people with simple things like take meeting notes in Confluence. Really simple stuff, easy to use, easy to see, oh, there's an editor in here, cool. And then move to, some more stable content like guidelines or roadmaps. And then finally, move in those pieces of content that are very important for the business, things like employee handbooks and expense reporting processes. And you can see over time how that helps users build trust in Confluence and an understanding that that is the source of the most valuable content. The next really important thing to focus on with Confluence is news. Right? Confluence has a built-in blog feature that's used by Atlassian themselves. Take a look at this blog from an Atlassian co-founder. Yes, they still write internal blogs. They're introducing a new team member here. You can see that there's links to related information, to people who know this person, and then people are adding comments. Rather than taking time away from everyone, having a meeting, sharing this information, they've shared it here on Confluence, and the conversation is only making the content more and more valuable over time. And again, we're doing this at K15T. So for example, the team that built our app Scroll Documents, they built it very, very quickly, very rapidly. And so each week they would write a blog to the entire company and say, hey, here's what we did last week. Here's some pictures. Give us some thoughts and feedback. And in that way, we were all able to collaborate and put input into this product. We think blogs are really valuable for 3 reasons. The first thing is they reach everyone, no matter where they're sitting, whether it's in an office or they're working from home. We think that it's important that people can access the information at the right time, right? I don't want my colleagues having to wait until 8 or 9 p.m. to stick on for a meeting that's convenient for me, right? Blogs are there when they need them. And of course, people can ask questions, have conversations, and give feedback on that information. Now, we've heard lots of feedback, right? Reasons that people are afraid to write blogs or don't feel comfortable with it. And these are valid reasons. I don't want to discount that. Instead, here's some advice and tips that we found to make it successful. First of all, foster an accepting culture. use that like button or use the comments and thank someone. Hey, thank you for taking your time, putting yourself out there and sharing what you're working on or what you've learned. Encourage people to write openly and often. If you're a leader especially, make sure people have time to do that. Don't let time be an excuse for why they haven't written a blog. And then make sure people know it's not a scary thing, right? We're not putting this on our marketing blog. If there's typos on it, don't worry about it. You're just sharing what you've learned. One of the ways we do this at K15T is within the first week of anyone starting, we have to write an introductory blog post. So for example, this is where I introduce like, hey, I used to be a customer of K15Ts and I work from home and I have dogs and those sorts of things. This really helps cement in employees' minds, hey, we're part of a team. We can share things with everyone. And this is just the beginning, right? And they're doing this at Atlassian as well. Atlassians are getting married and sharing about it, and they're building sandboxes and sharing about it. You can see how people are comfortable not just sharing work-related things, but other things they think might be valuable for their team members. One example of a company that we have worked with in the past was when they really wanted to boost the use of their blog, they started bringing in cakes on random days, and they would hide them in a meeting room. And they wouldn't tell anyone where the cake was. Instead, they would write a blog post. And in that way, people knew if I want a piece of cake, I have to tune into the blog every day to figure out where it is. That's one way to encourage adoption. Another thing we recommend, and this is on a user-by-user basis, we would recommend you encourage your users to subscribe to all the blog posts across Confluence. And you might be thinking, oh, that's too many blog posts. But think about it as a newspaper, right? You skim through the newspaper, you find the things that are useful to you, and you never know. You might find a story that you might have overlooked, but you actually find that to be very useful for your job role. Another area that's really valuable is the popular feed within the Confluence instance, because people can see how content is growing and changing, and there's a conversation around it, especially when you're first getting started. You're kind of creating that feeling of missing out, definitely not a fear. We don't want to motivate people by fear, but having that feeling of missing out on opportunities that would make me better at my job, make me better at collaborating with people. That's what the Confluence blog is all about. The third thing to focus on is content structure. You may have seen this when you give a new team a fresh, clean space and you watch it just kind of drift into chaos, right? Someone's like, oh, I created meeting notes, but I don't know where they went. And I started drafting up a project plan, but then we abandoned it and it's totally not valid anymore. This can get messy and you might be tempted to like, hey, I'm just going to throw away this space and I'll make another one. Don't do that, right? Spaces are intended to be very permanent structures within Confluence. We don't want to be adding and removing spaces all the time. That makes it inconsistent and hard for people to trust the location of content. Instead, keep spaces pretty concrete and use pages in a flexible way. So for example, if your company creates a lot of projects, don't create a new space for every project, right? Especially if you're doing it like twice a week, that's 100 new spaces a year. That's very, very daunting. Instead, have one space called projects and have a page within that space for each of the projects. Then you can have child pages beneath that and add a ton of content, but it's much easier and more, it's easier for people to find. And of course, big pages can get out of hand, certainly. So what we recommend then is show people like, hey, you can use headings and images, break up your content. In fact, if it's too big, break it up into subpages. That almost gives you like a table of contents where you can move through the content naturally right in Confluence. And within each space, we found there's sort of two types of contents that tend to emerge. The first type are very concrete anchored pieces like your roadmap or your product documentation. They don't change all that often. They're easy to organize and easy for people to know like, hey, this is where this should be. But then there's these other sort of loosey-goosey pieces of content like, I had a conversation with a colleague and they gave me a great idea, and so I stashed it away here. I don't really know what to do with it. For those pieces of unstructured content, we have some tips for keeping those under control so they don't clutter up the space. Recommend to users that they use their personal space for drafting content, or create a whole space for the team to draft things if they're creating a lot of content. Then move the content into a more permanent space once you know it's ready to go. you could also have a page in each space, which we do at K15T, where you can put pages under that where you're like, I think this might be out of date. We call ours the attic, and every once in a while we clean out the attic and get rid of those pages. Another thing you could do is just implement a good naming convention. Say, hey, if you're drafting something, put the word draft in the title. So if we find a 6-month-old page that says draft, we can just throw it away. Sometimes people recommend the approach of having a gardener. That's like an individual who is looking over a space or spaces to make sure the content is viable and up to date. We find that doesn't scale well at all. Instead, help build a culture where everybody on the team understands we all own this content. Who better to know if the content is viable than the team that's actually using it? So finally, these are approaches that everyone can use no matter what version of Confluence you're using. But we also recommend take a look at apps that are available for Confluence. We find that technology really helps bridge those gaps that make it difficult for people to step into Confluence. One of those apps is one that we put together when we were looking at this gap between people who are using Word and people who are using Confluence, right? Things like content organization. It's pretty easy, right? You just have a single document with all of your content, but tricky in Confluence. Finding your documents, that's tricky in both scenarios. Version management, again, very difficult. And then content distribution. It's easy to throw a Word document on an email, but it's harder to share Confluence stuff, especially if your colleagues aren't using it yet. So we came up with an app that we feel kind of addresses these needs, and we call it Scroll Documents. So with Scroll Documents, you can handle some of that document creation in a much more natural way for people who are used to the world of Word. So for example, imagine your HR team wants to create an employee handbook. So they've written different pieces of content in different pages or even in different spaces, and they want to bring them together in a document. So with Scroll Documents, you can do that by creating a new document. And then you select, here are the pages within this space or other spaces that I want to include in my document. And it turns it into one scrollable view of all of that content, which then you can share with your colleagues. Additionally, right, you might have multiple documents within your space. And so we've added a documents overview area in the left-hand menu. That way people can see all their documents, they can see who's working on them, what the document's about, and so on. And then, of course, there's the versioning aspect of things, right? Versioning is hard. 33% of people struggle with it. And so what we've done is added versioning so that maybe the HR team will work, and make version 1 and share it with everyone. And then they work on version 2, and then they share that with everybody. But maybe they want to lock things down. So maybe they want to add restrictions so that people don't see version 1 anymore because version 2 is the newest version. That kind of thing. So in this case, I'm going to take my employee handbook and make a new version of it. And you can see my version history on the side where I can compare what's changed between versions. And then we want people to be able to share things just as easily as they do with their Word file. So Scroll Documents integrates with our Word and PDF exporter apps so that users can quickly share their Confluence their Scroll Documents as a branded PDF that looks and feels like the document that they intended to create, like an employee handbook. So that's Scroll Documents, one of many apps that I really believe help bridge that gap for users as they're trying to adopt Confluence. So quickly, think about, at a higher level, sort of 2 phases when it comes to scaling Confluence. The first phase might involve you and other individuals from your organization who are passionate about Confluence. You really believe this is the best tool for us. It's going to take a lot of work pushing users to use it. No, do not email me that Word file. Go to a page, we'll collaborate there. Go find the cake, it's on the blog. It takes a lot of effort and sometimes a lot of time. You need support from leadership. The struggle is real. But what you'll find is you'll tend to move from this phase to another more exciting phase, and that is a pull phase, where users begin to go to Confluence naturally. Hey, I created a page, let's collaborate. Or, hey, I'm going to add additional content here. I'm going to write a blog. I'm going to organize things. And it's when you see your organization reach that phase that you see that you've really scaled well and that everyone has adopted Confluence properly. And in that way, you can continue to grow and you can see an environment of collaboration continue to build in your organization. So those are our thoughts on how to scale with Confluence. Now I'm going to pass things over to Phil, and he's going to talk a little bit about scaling with Jira.
Thanks, Matt. So let me preface this by explaining that my background is definitely more on the Jira side, and I have a few considerations that we're going to walk through when we discuss scaling Jira, because scaling Jira can be done in a number of different ways. And so we've got a number of angles that we can kind of take and approach these questions from. So before we dive into it, I want to talk about what does scaling Jira actually mean, because there's two different ways to talk about that. And these are two considerations that I think are important when we're discussing the scaling. First off is user scaling. And this means just adding more people to Jira, right? And this is a consideration when you have your proof of concept phase, everybody likes it, and now we're trying to get more and more teams on board. But user scaling also comes with adding different roles and different people on. So this is a different consideration. And just like Matt talked about in his Confluence, one of the benefits is you can prevent some of the siloing. When you're doing it on the Jira side, you also have to be mindful of siloing. And it's quite possible that you want to purposely silo certain information if it's sensitive, or if it's, if you're a pharma company and you're developing a new drug, you want to keep some of that information purposefully secret. But there's definitely reasons that you can do that. And there's also reasons not to do it. And it's up to you as the administrator to make those decisions. So there's some benefits, obviously, to scaling out and adding more people to your Jira. Having a single source of truth really helps. There's also a lot more business and IT alignment improvements that you can build on. We've noticed that happier teams are also a result, which is why Jira has just been so popular. But there are also a few drawbacks. So there are a few pitfalls that you might want to keep in mind. And because Jira is so flexible, every time a new team gets added, they might want to tweak the workflow that they're working on. And they want a different work type or issue type and issue links. And so these are things that you have to keep in mind, because while you have a lot of flexibility at your disposal, when you scale out, having some consistency between your teams is really, really important. So that's a pitfall that you really want to avoid. And then you also want to keep in mind that different teams work in different fashions. Software development teams have a tendency to be more agile, whereas teams like HR and legal have more tendencies to take waterfall approaches. And both of these things are supported in Jira, but you have to support them in different ways. And so having some of these tools at your disposal will definitely be helpful. Finally, the other type of scaling that I want to talk about is usage scaling. And that involves basically using more of Jira. Now that you have data in here, both past projects, current projects, you've got dependency maps, you've got all kinds of information at your disposal, you want to start using it to ask different questions of Jira. And this is where the extensibility of Jira and the ecosystem come in handy. You can build on it with apps. You can use EasyBI or Structure. Depending on what your use case is and what you're trying to solve, an app is often a great way to start and basically get these answers out to you. So the discussion, so obviously there are some benefits to this. Similarly, there's going to be a single source of truth. So everybody having a conversation about the data, it helps if we're all talking about the same thing. And so when we export data and you have your Excel sheet and I have my Excel sheet, we might even be talking about different numbers just because we use different methods to get there. Versus if we're talking about Jira data, we're all coming at it from that same central database of information. So we can get the insight from the same conversation. So we can have, insight from the same data and have the conversation one level higher. Again, there are also some pitfalls. When you start scaling this out, underlying dysfunctions will get amplified. So if you have a team that's late in updating statuses or they update their information late, this will reflect in any kind of analysis you do on their data. And there's also a cost increase. Ideally, obviously, this would be offset by any deprecation of tools and efficiency increase with your teams. But don't go into this blindly and thinking all this is free, obviously. There's also going to be some specialization of skills. With your teams developing and using these tools in more ways, you'll have different people who become experts. You'll have an expert in some of the BI tooling. You'll have an expert in how the structure tool works. And so this will impact their availability and their need to support the rest of the teams, which can be obviously super helpful, but it also might impact how much time that resource has available to do other things. So it's just something to keep in mind as we go through the different types of scaling that we can do. So that brings us to actually scaling Jira. What does that mean for you, and what does that mean for sometimes your agile processes? In particular, I want to discuss three different things. There's the scaling that has a performance-related impact and how you can mitigate that. There's also the element of permissions, and this is a way that you can control who has access to what, and what are the considerations that go into that when you start adding more and more people to Jira and using it differently. And then I want to conclude with some practical matters that basically are tips and tricks that we can share based on the experience that we have from helping a lot of different people solve these problems. So I want to come at this from two different angles. One, from a purely Jira perspective. So I want to talk about Jira out of the box. And after that, I want to discuss it as Jira as a whole system, including some of the add-ons and what to expect and what the considerations change when you have to take the whole systemic approach versus just looking at it as a single system. So Jira, we all know, it works great for teams. Teams love it. They even use team as their stock market ticker. It's highly configurable, which is kind of that double-edged sword that I mentioned earlier. You will have the ability to configure it to each team's needs, but you want to be actually quite strict in terms of when do you change some of these customizations, when will you give an exception to a team's way of working. Just because we've seen instances that have 55 different issue types and almost 60 issue link types. And this just becomes, unworkable when you try and scale things and ask these complicated questions. But Jira is a great foundation that you can build on, right? And it's something that we see a lot of people do. And because it's so extensible, it doesn't have a lot of these complex tools built in. That's where the add-ons come in. So today I'm going to talk about structure. I'm going to use structure as an example for the considerations that you should have. Any of the questions and the considerations that I discuss obviously also extend to other add-ons, right? So if you're talking about tempo timesheets, EasyBI, portfolio, what have you, the considerations that you're going to make basically apply to any and all, both individually and as a whole. So just for a bit of a background, structure is a visualization tool. It allows you to track your Jira data and how they're related to each other. It builds on Jira data like almost all the add-ons. You start with your Jira issues and issue links as a starting point, and then you build out of them. And it's very customizable as well, just kind of following that same Jira philosophy. So let's talk about Jira performance. The easiest conversation to have actually revolves around the hardware, because that's not something you should depend on when you're scaling. Don't assume that just because you can add a better CPU to your server or add some more RAM or add some more memory, that is going to save you from any other poor decisions that you've made when you're scaling out your Jira instance. So one of the things I actually want to suggest is stay one tier below the maximum that you can do so that you do have that as a fallback option, but pretty much every other thing should come first. You should be a lot more involved in proactively monitoring certain things and keeping performance down before you go in and say, all right, well, I guess we're just going to have to double the RAM on our Jira machine. The other element that I want to talk to you about is user training. This is actually the hardest part because, as I'm sure we've all been aware, getting people to learn something and learn a certain way of doing is kind of like herding cats. And while it is difficult, it is much more efficient to do this before you give them all the access that they want on your Jira machine, rather than fixing things down the road. Getting people on board and working correctly can save you a lot of headaches down later when something breaks. And so we recommend actually having a pretty comprehensive training and onboarding program for anyone who comes to Jira. If you're the admin, even if they've seen Jira before, either at a different company or in a different department, be strict. Have them go through some of the best practices guides that you have. Learn how you guys do things on your Jira instance. Tell them why. If they have needs outside of that, tell them what the process is to ask for that. but basically train them as best you can, because this is definitely going to be one of the hardest aspects to control. So setting them off on the right path is definitely paramount. Another one is going to be profiling and monitoring. We really suggest you be both proactive and reactive. So there's an element of being proactive by regularly checking your logs, your system profile, check your read writes, check your database pools, all these things. And we can have a whole webinar just on this, but my suggestion would be to regularly check what is a baseline for performance. And anytime you exceed a certain threshold, whether it's on the database side, or on the RAM side, or just the loading on the user side, have some sort of warning mechanism in place so that you can go in and figure out what's going on. Because you can have this problem from different angles. It can be a resource that's limited. It can be someone who wrote an inefficient query and is taking down the entire instance. And in these situations, you have different resolution avenues. You can either talk to the person, fix the query, or you can go in and lock them out, or you can go in and, like I said, upgrade your hardware if that's a limitation that you're running into. So definitely do this, profile and monitor proactively. You're going to have to be reactive as well, right? If someone takes down Jira, you're going to have to figure out what happened. And this is going to be all the places that you're going to be looking. But proactively, you can avoid certain things before they become problems. And that's definitely something that we highly recommend. And then finally, on the performance side, use support. It's cheaper than therapy, but build on the fact that there's a huge ecosystem for Jira. There's a whole community out there that is happy for you to post a question, and then they'll have answers, war stories, suggestions for you. There are also consultants out there, people who've done nothing but spend their entire professional careers implementing Jira systems and focusing on getting that right. And so sometimes that's just the best option you have at your disposal, and you should definitely use them because they know what they're talking about, and they're definitely there to help. So let's have the same discussion about an add-on. So for structure, we have the same 4 topics to discover. We can talk about hardware to increase some of the performance issues that you might run into, but user training is definitely always going to be number 1. It's the hardest thing to do, but it's definitely kind of the recommended avenue to take. Getting people trained to know what they have at their disposal, what they can do and what they can't do, definitely is a recommendation. So anytime you roll out a new add-on, make sure that your users are aware of what they're being given access to, under what conditions this access is being given, i.e. also when this access is potentially revoked, and then also know how you can profile and proactively monitor it. You can check the normal things, so you can check your database, you can check the Jira instances, but you can also go in and look at add-on specific performance related and support information. And for example, Structure has what we call a performance audit log, and it's a log that shows you all the loading times for each individual structure. So you can proactively monitor those, have a script that goes through it once a day, and that will tell you if something goes above a certain threshold. And just like before, there's also support. You can ask the community questions, you can ask us questions, either directly or through our support channel. Everybody's kind of here to help, and that's one of the cool things about the ecosystem. The next topic I wanted to discuss when we're dealing with scaling is some of the permissioning that you can go through. The first is actually the easiest one. This will be oftentimes dictated by your industry and your kind of company culture, whether you're an open first or closed first organization, whether you think everybody should have access to everything as a default and then lock things down as that trust is abused, or it turns out they don't need it. Most of the case, though, we see people using a closed first system for their permissions, and they will go in and create groups, and using those groups, they will incrementally give access to different things. This is usually probably a good idea when it comes to siloing information. So if there's information that you don't want people to have access to, you can use groups to limit access to certain people. And we see this when rolling out different functionality as well. You can add people to different groups because you can have membership and not. And so for different add-ons, you can have permission levels of control versus view only. And so this is a great tool that you can use at your disposal to give people access to view information, but not necessarily edit it and do potentially more damage just because they haven't gone through that training yet. So this is definitely a tool that you can use as one of the gatekeepers. On the flip side though, that is not always going to be your decision. So there are going to be times where you have to have a process in place to decide who gets extra access. Users are going to come to you and they're going to ask like, hey, I can't see this project or I can't see this tool. And there needs to be some sort of audit, there needs to be some sort of process in place to decide when someone gets access. And in this case, you want to be very, very clear on who is responsible for giving someone that kind of access. It can be either the owner of the project, it can be their team lead, it can be a combination of that and you. But realize that you all have to agree on giving someone extra access, and then afterwards making sure that everything goes well, that they have the training they need, that they have the understanding of the system that they need, so that they can be successful and that they don't do any kind of damage. Similarly, there's permissions on an app level. So in a good news, permissions can't be used on an app to bypass some of the Jira permissions, right? They'll be always respected. And that's part of the architecture of how all these apps kind of are built. You still have that same question though, who needs access and to what? And so from our perspective, we usually recommend people when they roll out across an organization that they have some sort of training program in place for people to understand and get to a certain comfort level with both Jira and within the app to understand, all right, this is what I have, this is the power that has been given to me. These are things I should definitely not do. We recommend, for example, that people don't pull in every issue from the Jira database. That tends to make things slow, for example. Similarly, there should also be a process of when should we give them what kind of access. And we see in a lot of cases that you can go in and using those same groups, you can go in and set permission to access certain features and certain functionality. And you can do this to incrementally give people both insight first, because if all they need really is the results of a calculation, whether it's in structure, portfolio, or ECBI, it doesn't really matter. If they need view-only permission just to see the results of something, then only give them view-only permission. And similarly, if they need more, make sure that they get through those phase gates or any kind of system that you have in place before you give them all that extra power. So let me finish up with a few practical matters that kind of sum up some of the philosophical things that I discussed today. From a Jira perspective, consistency is really important. And that meaning that between projects and also between different teams being added aboard. I would highly recommend you avoid creating new issue types and new issue links unless there's a very good reason that the existing ones don't work. We've seen a lot of people, they'll create an issue link called implements, and that is to tie a higher order issue to a lower one in the work breakdown structure. There's no reason to then create another issue called contains and another one called, parent specifically. So sometimes having very generic ones is a good idea, and exceptions should be rare and they need to be well motivated, and you need to realize what some of the consequences could be if you make one. The same can be said about workflows and other project attributes. We recommend, generally speaking, that you have a very generic workflow that you can start people with, especially if people are new to Jira. To do in progress and done is enough. When they have a much more complicated project and they understand what they're doing and they have higher level needs, so they have a different usage scaling question, it can make sense to go in and specify a new workflow that really maximizes their work. But it helps to start with something generic so that they can get started and really get a feel for what they're doing. And then one of the other things, and this is tied to that user training, encourage a migration and onboarding to your way of working with Jira. And so that means that you have training available that you can go through consultants or through the Atlassian University. And that's good to get a basic understanding of the functionality of Jira. But we recommend that you also have on top of that a specified document, which can obviously live in Confluence somewhere, that explains how you as an organization work with Jira. So why you have certain issue links, what the processes you have for requesting more access. And this kind of already keeps people in line before they start asking and trying too many things, because Jira is a very flexible tool and you don't want them going off and doing something that changes and impacts all your other users. And then finally, the community is one of the best features of Jira, actually. So you can go out and ask any kind of questions, whether it's something about, where does this feature live? How can I toggle it? Versus, hey, I'm trying to onboard this new team. What are my best practices? What are your recommendations for workflows? These are the needs, etc. From a add-on perspective, there are a few more considerations to keep in mind. First off, sharing is caring. So we definitely believe that it's a good idea to add the workflows, add the information there, and then make that available to everyone. So putting information that you created in structure in a Confluence page, for example, is very helpful, because that means they can all see and gain the insight and leverage the tool for everybody's benefit. It also means that it's probably best not to duplicate a lot of the effort. If somebody created a global work breakdown structure, you don't need every business owner creating a separate one. So if you have information that is generally applicable, make it public so that people can see it. Then look, don't touch is kind of a good philosophy when it comes to introducing tools. Give people view-only access so they can see what the tool does. If they notice it's slow and they double down on how many issues are in it, they can expect it to be slower. If it's something that gives them great insight, then they will probably go in and be like, oh, hey, I want to learn how this tool works so I can maximize its usage. So give them that first glimpse without necessarily throwing them into the deep end. And then finally, a reiteration, we're here to help. Use the community, use the support from the admin teams, use the support from the actual add-on builders, use the consultants. Everybody will have insight that you can leverage and kind of build on. So that brings us to the Q&A. I'm going to hand the proverbial microphone back to Dave. And
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt. So we have a number of questions in the queue that I'm going to read to the presenters. And I'd like to just take a minute to remind everyone, if you have any questions, this is also an opportunity to get some free consulting here. So feel free to ask away. And if we don't get to your question, as I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we'll actually follow up with you via email. Assuming you don't ask your question anonymously, by the way, which is one of the options. So the first question is for you, Matt. Leadership in my company is reluctant to recommend Confluence to everyone. People are already used to using other things. How can I convince leadership that Confluence and collaboration on Confluence is important?
That's a good question. I guess a big thing that I found is successful is don't just talk to leadership about technical specs or about feature sets. They're thinking big picture, right? They might be answering to, very high level leadership or even to the board of the company. So talk instead about benefits to the company. One that I mentioned, right, is just the time aspect, the reduction in time that is spent sending files back and forth or cutting out meetings. That can be huge if you just take a few situations like, hey, we cut out these meetings, and then figure out your company's billable hourly rate, put some figures together and pass that to leadership. Show them, hey, this isn't just another tool. This is the tool. Look at how it's saving us time. Another thing is be in contact with your IT group about licensing costs. Like, hey, we could replace these 3 legacy apps that we're using with Confluence. Get those figures together. That will speak much more to leadership. And then also show how things are being delivered quickly. Goals are being met through collaboration. A lot of things like that, they can be fun to see at like the administrator level, but to speak with leadership, they really need to see proof that this is a good tool to push across the organization, I guess.
Thanks, Matt. Phil, let's pick a question that's more along the Jira lines. Are there, one of our participants asks, are there any limits on how many apps or how many users can be on a Jira instance?
As far as I'm aware, there aren't any limits to how many apps you can have on your Jira instance. There are things to keep in mind, though, that there is a natural performance cost to adding more and more apps. So while it's probably nice and practical in certain aspects to just add more and more tools to the tool chain, it's usually a good idea to keep things to a minimum. If at all, you can kind of avoid it. We think that in most cases, the larger your instance actually gets, the fewer apps you're going to want to have on it, because the little ones that only a few people use will only provide incremental value, versus the performance hit that it gives to the entire instance is definitely one that you want, is a weighing of concerns that you want to have a conversation about internally. As to users, as far as I'm aware, you can put a lot of users on a nice DC instance. So from my understanding is there aren't any limits on that end either.
Great, thank you. Hey, Matt, could I remind you to advance to the next slide? And next question is for you anyway, also, Matt. What are some of the things that users need to keep in mind as as Confluence usage grows? In our organization, it's become a bit of a mess, a little bit of the Wild West, if you will. And how do we rein that in and control it?
Things can get messy. And like I said, when you hand somebody a space or even a page, they're using a new tool. And some of the concepts in Confluence are so new that it isn't like somebody's really messy desktop that has 100 Word documents on it. It's now everybody's shared source of content. So in a case like that, one of the things that I think would be helpful is if you've had some great templates. So within Confluence, you can have templates. In fact, there's some that are included that are really helpful, so that when users go to create a new page, they have an idea like, hey, this is how we write requirements documents. I don't need to make a new page, and add a bunch of macros and things to it. I'm just going to use this template. So keeping things consistent and making it easy for users to do that is really huge. I've even heard of some teams, they'll create a whole blueprint in Confluence, which is an image of an entire Confluence space with pre-existing pages, and they will use that blueprint so that when a group of users say, hey, I need a new team space for our team, the administrator will just roll out a whole new space that already is fully structured for them. So adding some of that structure, I think, would be really helpful. And then again, make sure everyone on the team knows, hey, this is all of our responsibility. It isn't just a dumping ground for your content. It is a shared living point of truth for the entire organization.
Great, thank you. All right, we're coming up on the top of the hour, so we do have about half a dozen questions still in the queue, but as I've mentioned several times now, don't worry. We'll follow up with you directly if we did not get to your question here. I just will wrap up reminding everybody that within 1 or 2 business days, you'll find an archive of this webinar or a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel. Just go to alm.work/YouTube. It'll get you there quickly, and look for the playlist called Webinar Archive. If you want to learn more about structure, you can follow the URL that you see in the middle of the screen there. If you're more interested in any of the Confluence products that Matt mentioned, just go to the K15T's website. And if there's anything at all that we didn't cover or a question that you meant to ask or forgot to ask, you can always send emails to webinars@almworks.com, and we'll make sure the question gets answered by the appropriate person. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar in these unusual times. Hopefully you found benefit from attending today, and hopefully we'll see you again in another of our monthly webinars. Thank you very much.